Hey, family, this is Doug Reed with the Let's Go Show. I'm excited once again to have a distinguished guest with me. Chris Boardman. We'll get actually into details as far as what Chris does, and you get an opportunity to hear his story. So, first of all, I'll just say, Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I mean, absolute pleasure. Kind of meta, social media is very important. I mean, we actually kind of met on LinkedIn, and I mean, just tell us a little bit about you, and then of course we'll get into the younger Chris.
Sure. Um, well, let's see. We'll get into the resume and all the rest of that. I've been an active um, professional musician for 55 years, and I've been playing the piano since I was 4 years old. So it's a big part of me. That's taken me through a lot of different experiences. Um, um, I taught at the college level. I taught graduate school at the University of Miami from 2012 to 2018. And when I left there under curious circumstances, difficult circumstances, and my primary uh, question that I asked myself when I left was, how do I want to spend my time? What's important to me? And that led me to saying, I'm getting tired of staring at a box all day. My training was working with live musicians, live ensembles, and everything from a trio to a 115-piece orchestra over all those years. So now what I'm up to is I'm at a kind of a point in life where I'm not necessarily interested in getting another notch on the gun belt, kind of like been there, done that. Um, Trying to continually find ways to grow as an artist, as a human being, while also making a positive impact on the world around me. And I can get into why that's important to me.
Yeah, I love that because it's a new phrase that I'm coming. Actually, a friend of mine, Thornell Rice, he works with a nonprofit organization called the Confess Project. They actually train barbers to be mental health advocates. But in a lot of our conversation, talking about people like us, it's just being positive disruptors. So
Absolutely.
much is going on in the social media world, the World Wide Web. I think we have enough negativity, but we don't have enough positivity. Uh,
Sure.
so,
Absolutely. I
uh, yeah,
absolutely agree.
so let's disrupt the airways with our positive conversation and things that we do. So let's get right into it. Let's talk about the younger Chris.
Well, sure. So I'm, like I said, I'm now 69 years old. So I was born in 1954, and I had an experience where my older brother, who was 2 years older than I was, had chronic tonsillitis. And the doctor said, well, we got to take his tonsils out. In the 50s, that was a really, really popular way of dealing with tonsillitis. And my parents, for some unknown reason, which I never got a straight answer about, said, well, why don't we take his tonsils out too, even though my tonsils were fine. And so we showed up at the hospital. My brother has his surgery, and I go into the operating room, and I don't come back, and I don't come back. And my mom is going nuts. She says, what's wrong? What's wrong? She had this expectation that it would take the same length of time for me to have the surgery. And the doctor came out and told her, says, part of this surgery was to check the autoimmune system as just a routine practice. And he discovered that my adenoids were growing abnormally into my inner ear. And he took them out, and he told my parents that I'd be totally deaf by the time I was 6 or 7 years old, with such a gradual loss in hearing that by the time you notice the hearing loss, there would be nothing that they could do.
So wait a
6 months
minute.
later. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's
yeah,
crazy.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
it's nuts.
because I got to go back.
Yeah,
And I love my brothers. I have two older brothers.
right.
Uh, But I can only imagine, like my older brother's going in for surgery for his tonsils,
Right.
and then mom and dad say, "Hey, I
Yeah.
guess this clears up the whatever is happening in his tonsils to make his voice better, voice box. I mean, I don't know. So let's actually have both of them get their tonsils out, and
To
then
save
we."
the well, the what I got from my parents was, well, save him the pain and the discomfort that he may go through in the future.
Oh,
r- Right?
so for later on in life,
Yeah, yeah, you have kind of a prophylactic
yeah,
surgery, if you will.
definitely a preventive measure.
Well,
But
based on the information at the time, they made their choice. So the crazy thing is, I was 3 years old at the time. 6 months later, my parents asked me what I wanted for my birthday, and I told them I wanted a piano. Now, I grew up in a science household. There was no music in the house at all. My dad was a rocket scientist. My mom was a housewife. There was no musical people in the family at all. And out of the blue, I said I wanted a piano. So they rented a piano, and I sat down the day the piano arrived and started plunking out melodies by ear.
wow,
So that is one of several, multiple experiences that I've had throughout my life. Call it God, call it a higher power, call it whatever you want. I'm not big on labels in terms of spirituality, but I am very comfortable in accepting the fact that I've had a guardian angel on my shoulder.
wow.
Right. And so from that point forward, it's been, throughout my life in a overall sense, it's been about honoring that gift. It's been about paying attention to it and not taking it for granted, and being living with a life of gratitude and humility, because I don't feel like I'm personally responsible for it. Right? It comes from someplace else. I have no idea where or how. I just accept it and try to honor and use it as best I can. And so I started taking piano lessons. I wasn't even in school yet, and I didn't know how to read. So my dad, this is kind of wild. He went to Manual Arts High School in South Central Los Angeles. That's where he grew up. And he went to Manual Arts was a predominantly white school at the time, but he lived almost adjacent to Central Avenue. So he made it a point as a teenager to go to Central Avenue and hear all the Black artists, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, and all the rest of those. So when I expressed an interest in music, he had all of this jazz background, and so he hired Lawrence Welk's piano player to come out to the house to give me piano lessons.
Wait a minute.
We were living in LA.
Yeah, we got to go back, because even as our listeners, you got to.
Yeah, who knows who Lawrence Welk is?
Yeah,
right.
I know who Lawrence Welk is,
Yeah.
but
Lawrence Welk was a band leader. He started out as a polka band, played the accordion, and then he had a wildly successful syndicated dance band TV show, and it went 30 years. It was on the air.
Yeah, a long time.
Yeah. So my dad said, let's get a session player to come out and teach this kid. So this guy comes out, and the first lesson he would play the example. I would mimic the example, right, from the John Thompson Red Book. This standard beginning piano literature. The next week he came back and he said, here, play this measure. And he looked up at the music, and I looked at him and I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. I can't read. I can play what you play it for me, but I can't read the music. So he said, he told my parents, says, listen, it's kind of a waste of time to teach him piano lessons, to give him piano lessons if he doesn't know how to read. Wait until he goes to school. And this is, decades before the Suzuki method. So I was kind of left to my own devices. Years later, my mother said that in that interim time, I would put my little record player on the piano bench and learn songs by listening to the records that I was playing. So when I was 7 years old, we moved to another house, and there was a woman up the street who gave piano lessons to all the neighborhood kids, right? So I started taking lessons from her. My first recital, I played the Minute Waltz, Chopin Minute Waltz at tempo. I'm 8 years old. Then the next year, I played it's like a 15-page waltz, grand waltz brillante is what it's called in E flat. And she came to my parents and said, "He's beyond me. There's nothing I can teach him."
Yeah.
And so she had this brilliant aha moment. At the time, Arthur Rubinstein had just recorded an album of all the Chopin waltzes. And she said, "Go buy the record and then practice along with the recording." So I would drop the needle in the family room, run over to the piano, and I would play along and try to mimic, Rubinstein's interpretation. So after that recital, I got really bored and started, it's because it was not challenging to me at all. And sometime later, when I was about 10 or 11, my parents hauled me off to play for some woman, strange woman. So God knows where it was, Pasadena or someplace. And we drove over there, and I played for her, and then we left. And I never heard anything about it after that. Now, my old man was a rocket scientist, and he had top secret security clearance because he was a pivotal part of the Apollo program. So he's really good at keeping secrets. So I never knew what that meeting was all about. Well, towards the end of my mother's life, it turned out that was an audition for Juilliard as a 10-year-old, and they wanted me. And my parents decided they didn't want to move to New York.
But let me ask you though, because I mean, now you realize, even as a young child, that you're very gifted.
I just did what I did. I had no real comprehension or anything to base it on.
Did you feel a certain level of confidence in actually doing it or performing it?
It's a funny thing. There's a whole other story about that, but musically, I've been fearless. It's like, oh, let's go do that. Let's go figure this out. I'm a curious guy and a problem solver by nature. And so, yeah, so that's what's kind of propelled me through this career of multiple job descriptions. I've been a recording artist. I've been a producer. I've been a conductor. I've scored 140 films. I've worked with people like Quincy Jones and David Foster. I've worked with all vaudeville acts like Bing Crosby and Shirley MacLaine and Julie Andrews. Done all of this stuff, right? And it's just basically saying, wow, isn't this fun? Let's go jump into this sandbox and try to figure it out as we go. So to answer your question, yeah, it's musically fearless, totally fearless. I've had the confidence from a very young age that it was never a mystery to me, and I could figure out just about anything. So
did you have a certain level of not only just the confidence, but did you have a certain level of peace in doing it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Now, the flip side of this, and it's something what I didn't get at home. My parents never taught me conflict management skills, so it was kind of like a bar graph with gaps in the middle. Some things were really great, and then there was just non-existent other aspects of their parenting skills. And my mother, this is another wild ass story. When I was small, my mother would ask me to play, and then she would be so uncomfortable because she couldn't put a label on my musical ability, couldn't accept it, wanted to put a label on it, and couldn't comprehend it in some sort of a logical fashion. She would get so uncomfortable, she'd either start talking or walk out of the room. And she did this unconsciously until I was in my 30s, and I finally confronted her about it. Consequently, I drifted towards composition and orchestration because that was something that I could manage on my own. And because a 5-year-old just has no way to be able to process that kind of rejection. I mean, I'm told that when I was a little boy, the doorbell would ring and I'd run over to the piano and want to play. And they interpreted that as being a show off. My take on it was, I just wanted to share it with people. It's like, this is so cool. You got to check this
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, oh, he's just looking for attention, So as a result, I have a very odd relationship with the piano. I haven't performed in public for over 30 years because there's this just internal struggle about constantly being judged that I just would prefer to avoid. If I'm in a band or I'm conducting or something, that's something that is controllable, not where the focus is totally on me. Now, that being said, at this point in my life, I'm actually got my first solo piano gig in decades in a couple of weeks. So, we'll test the waters and see if this is something I really want to do. So to just kind of leapfrog through the story, I started playing in rock and roll bands and then graduated to jazz bands. We were doing all original songs. So I was like 14 years old when I first got paid to make music, playing original music. And then I started writing music for the college big band. And then I met a guy who became my mentor. His name is Billy Byers. He's a legendary arranger, trombone player. And we became musical partners. And so from the age of 18, I did my first TV show arrangement when I was 20 years old, went on the road as a musical director at 22. And then it was just like a rocket ship ride, working with his clients as a peer. We would work elbow to elbow in the same room. And I was a young guy in my early 20s, So that's, my goal was not to become famous. My goal was not to become rich. I just was so addicted to making music that that was my goal. I just want to stay busy. I didn't really care what kind of music. I didn't have like a specific thing. I want to be this kind of musician. No, I just want to be involved in the activity of making music. So that enabled me to transition as the world changed.
Let me ask you, how much, for lack of better words, how much time did you spend in a given day in the presence of music or on the piano?
Well, I was never really good at practicing. I was really good at playing. And the thing is music is like a 24/7 radio in my head. So it's, and I've come to accept it's always there. All I have to do is pay attention to it. So yeah, it consumed me. I ended up not graduating from college because I wasn't really interested in taking all those gen ed courses and getting that kind of broad background, because it was really clear to me, who I was and what my life was about. So I got this gig as a musical director in 1976, and I left 3 months before I was supposed to graduate. So.
And a lot of great people have left college to pursue.
Yeah. And the wild thing is, I ended up teaching college. So the kids all love me. The faculty, they were a little skeptical, but that's a whole other story. So I did that daily for 35 years, and then the world changed after 9/11. And we'd had the dot bomb where all Silicon Valley tanked in the late 90s, and then 9/11 happened, and Hollywood started to constrict. Napster had virtually decimated the record industry, and technology was disrupting the culture, not just a business model, right? And so I got really interested at the time. I was working in artist development, trying to figure out how do I write songs and get singers record deals. That was kind of like my intellectual goal. And this is about the time when MySpace took off. And I was introduced to a Saturday morning tech group, giants of technology, alpha dog CEOs who would roll out of breakfast or out of bed on a Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, without coffee, show up at a restaurant with about 30 of us, and then debate, where the world was headed. This is like 2004, 2005. And in this group were legendary people. I mean, the guy, Rex Swan, the guy who wrote the code that created Google, created AdSense, was a regular member of this group. A good friend of mine, Bobby Husinski, who's written 25 plus books on popular music, was a part of that group. A guy named Michael Turpin, who is now a Bitcoin superstar, was a part of this group. There's another guy, Larry Gerbrand, who was a really dear friend, who was a senior VP of Nielsen Analytics. He would analyze TV shows and all that data gained about TV ratings and figure out what was what. And so my mind was blown, because like getting my own private MBA program with these guys, right? So I just sat on my hands for the 6 months, first 6 months, and didn't say a word and just listened to all this conversation, knowing at the time that full well that the career that I had enjoyed in the 20th century had a fuse lit and was going to come to an end. And I was trying to figure out, well, I'm too young to retire. So how do I take my skill set, which is being a high price cog in somebody else's wheel, and because basically as a film composer or an orchestrator or an arranger in the music business, I was a high price gun for hire that would create a custom product for a closed distribution network. Right? In the 90s and before, the media companies had a vice grip on distribution. And so you either played in that vertical or you didn't. And with the advent of social media, it became a level playing field. And so then the dynamic of it changed, and I could just instinctively tell that vice grip over distribution was going to end, and I'd be out of a job, and my career would be over. Pretty crazy thinking that I've had all of this success for 35 years and then come face to face with the fact that it's all going to end, and then the damn thing I can do about it.
And what were some of those accomplishments as artists that you've worked with?
Oh my gosh. It's a pretty long list. I carry it around with me like a big sack of potatoes over my shoulder. But I've won 6 Emmy Awards, 13 Emmy nominations. Quincy Jones called me to work on The Wiz in 1978. Worked, got an Academy Award nomination for my work on The Color Purple. Maybe somewhere north of $8 billion in box office in terms of the films that I've contributed to. Worked with legendary composers and arrangers, people like Marvin Hamlish and David Foster and Bruce Broughton, who did Silverado. That was my first orchestral feature that I orchestrated in 1985. Ralph Burns, Dave Grusin, the list, those guys that goes on. I was like one of those guys. I was a handful of guys who had this skill to where I could show. In fact, Michael Kamen, who did Lethal Weapons and the Die Hards and Band of Brothers, and he was a dear friend of mine. And his agent called me up and said, "Go meet Michael at the Mondrian Hotel on Sunset Boulevard." And I meet him at midnight, and he gives me this cue to write for the next day, which was the end of Lethal Weapon 1. So I had this reputation of being able to deliver on time, quickly, with quality work. So at the time, there was really, there was so many films being made. I mean, now there's like 80 films a year. In the 80s, Hollywood was, because of cable, network, cable TV pipeline was so huge. Hollywood was making over 400 films a year. And so there was this enormous amount of work. I had this reputation, and the phone would just ring. So,
is there any artist or particular group that, let's say, if you had to pick a top three, what would be the top three significant events or in during those times that you can think of?
well, it's I think, that's a really difficult question to answer. I appreciate the question, but it's really hard because each period of my life has different superstars, right?
I like that.
So, I was hired to accompany Rosemary Clooney on a Bing Crosby show when I was 23. That one stands out just because it was Bing Crosby. It was about 6 months before he died. Musical artists, Quincy is right up there at the top. He's a really deep guy, and consistently over throughout the years, from a performer, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. I mean, I distinctly remember the first time I got hired to become Tom Jones' musical director, 1977. And I remember the first time I heard him sing live, and that was like a jaw-dropping moment.
And Tom Jones had his own variety show as well, right?
He did in the 60s.
Yeah. Well, I was born in '63, so I remember those shows, the Lawrence
So I
Welk.
mean, it kind of varies, and then just to be honest, the people that I worked with on a day-to-day basis, the unsung heroes of the Hollywood session world, the caliber of musicianship is unmatched anywhere in the world. So those are the people that I worked with. Those are my friends. Those are my peers. Those are the people I spend my time with. So an artist would come floating through. I mean, everywhere from Ethel Merman to Josh Groban and everybody in between. It's just another day at the office. So it's kind of hard to identify a specific artist along the way.
Have you ran into another younger Chris Boardman?
No, not only because the world has changed so radically that it's not appealing to the younger generation, because what I've done is not necessarily relevant to a young person's life. That's my take on it. I did have a student in Miami who probably comes the closest of anybody that I've met. His name's Steven Schwartz. He goes on by the name Steven. He's a dubstep artist. He's like got 250 million, God knows how, views on YouTube. I mean, he's like hugely successful, but he plays all the instruments himself. The way he programs his music is very much in a arranger's orchestral mindset. He's remarkable. I think he's really amazing.
Wow.
There's another young artist that was also a student for a time in Miami named Veronica Swift, who has gone on to, she was like a trumpet player. Her parents were both jazz musicians, and she's a remarkable jazz vocalist. Now she's also like interested in all the above as well. So she's doing like all sorts of alternative music now as well. But she was named like top 10 female vocalists in the world as like a 25-year-old. So they're out there. They just occupy a different bandwidth, and part of my role in moving forward in terms of having an impact, and this kind of gets deep on a 30,000 foot level, is with all of my tech experience. We first started thinking about AI about 15 years ago, and coming face to face that in the early 2000s, that technology was not a business cycle. I could see that there would be a massive change in our culture, which has now evolved into everybody staring at their phones every day, right? And the pandemic has pushed us into isolation, even more so than individual devices, Instagram and Twitter and all the like. But there's from a sociological point of view, a cultural anthropological point of view, human beings, first of all, the brain is really good at survival. That's its job. But with all of the innate or internal power of the human body and what we're capable of, connecting to other people is how we survive. If we keep going down this path of isolation becoming the norm, the ability to connect with other people will be lost. And we're at the precipice of this huge shift that kind of dwarfs the smartphone in terms of AI. And so I personally think that art is what connects human beings together. It's a form of communication. Music predates language. Human beings have been using music, even if it's just drums, as a form of communication for thousands of years. So it's inbred in our physical being. Our brains have evolved to recognize music as being something to pay attention to. With all these individual devices, we're like missing this connection with other folks. So I think that we need art now more than ever in human history, because, as I said a second ago, we're on the precipice of allowing technology to determine what humanity actually is. And so think about that. You're a Star Trek fan. We are the Borg, you will be assimilated. I mean, that's the world that we're headed into.
Yeah.
And we kind of blindly followed along as technology pushed us into smartphone and internet technology. We didn't know any better. All of this disinformation and polarization between people is because we're just not good at filtering that information. To your point about positivity, we have to, there are people who see the challenge for what it is, like yourself, says we got to do something about this. My role, my avenue is to just remind people of how valuable music is for other reasons other than just selling a product or to feel good in a specific moment. Because if we do not stand up and define what we want humanism to be, we will lose the ability to make that distinction and have that kind of impact. So it's a very, very powerful, important time in human history.
Yeah, and music has always been about expression.
Yeah, you bet.
because that's, being able to express ourselves. I mean, we got all the different senses, the smell, the touch, but, being able to express ourselves. And, when you deal with somebody individually and get the reaction, or find out who they really are,
Yeah.
that's so impactful. I mean, I'm thinking about this because even yesterday, I'm not that far from Atlantic City, and I was down there getting my car fixed, and I end up going to the boardwalk, and I saw a young man. Well, I say young man, turned out to be 85 years old,
Hmm.
white man, but he was a pilot, and we sat there and talked for about 35 minutes,
Wow.
and it was so rewarding. And I think about, like you said, technology. I think about AI and everything that's going on, because we really don't have those kind of conversations anymore.
No, we don't. We don't.
And a lot of times I know for me, I mean, coming up in the 70s,
Mhm.
with everything that was going on, even back in those times, civil rights, like music was a way to express ourselves.
And to connect with other people who had similar interests, so that there is a relationship to where, oh, you like the Birds, oh, you like Earth, Wind, and Fire, well, then you must be a friend of mine.
Yeah. You
You
nailed
know,
it. You nailed it.
you know. So the thing is there's only so far it can go if you're listening by yourself. I think a lot about this, and this project that I'm working on at the moment makes me, forces me to think about this. But so let's just take singing in church as an example.
Mhm.
If you are, well, the human body responds physiologically to the music that we listen to.
Mhm.
Our bodies will react with has nothing to do with our conscious mind, nothing to do with our tastes. Sure, that has an impact, but the fact of the matter is, if you listen to a fast song, your heart rate is going to increase. If you listen to a slow song, your heart rate is going to slow down. At the same time, when your heart rate slows down, your respiration changes. And when that respiration changes, that when you start taking deeper, more normal breaths and your body's in a state of equilibrium, your brain is getting more oxygen. So it's going to react differently than if you're afraid and you're panting, and your brain is not getting that oxygen. So let's think about this in terms of singing in church. You've got parishioners, and they're all focused on the same thing. They're all singing the same song. And so in essence, what you're doing is creating a hive, basically, where everybody's vibrating at the same frequency.
Mhm.
So it seems to me to make all kinds of sense why there's music in church, because it brings people together, and you get to be able to feel the person next to you vibrating at the same frequency. Have you ever been to church and you stand there and you don't sing? It's a completely different experience than if you're
Yes.
singing with everybody else. And it really doesn't matter if you're singing well or not. There is no judgment involved here.
No, it's not.
Right? So it's become really, really important to me at this point to be the standard bearer for that concept of saying, if we want to be able to work together and actually learn how to listen to people, music can accomplish that by, as you were mentioning before, music is a form of expression. If you feel a certain way and you play a certain song, or you go to see a certain band that makes you feel the same way, now they play that song on stage, and now the entire audience has a similar feeling at the same time,
Yeah.
which washes away all of the fear and the judgment that can happen when you're trying to figure out, am I cool or am I under threat?
Hmm.
So that's really where my brain is at this point.
And tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing and what actually
Sure,
got you to that point to do the work that you're doing.
sure. So I got hired to teach, to become the director of a college music program, commercial music program. Didn't have a college degree, so I'm immediately an outsider in the academic world. And I got hired based on my resume. You know, they wanted to put me up on a pedestal and make me a show pony and boost enrollment, basically. And I was fine with that because, you know, I was looking for a way to be able to give back. You know, I wasn't there to bolster my ego or my resume, you know.
Mhm.
So turns out with no training, I was massively successful. I tripled the amount of enrollment in this program by 300% in 3 years. In terms of applicants, we went from 2 new students to turning away 75 kids a year.
Wow.
And so, you know, I was just doing what I think is right and, you know, trying to do as good a job as I can do. And they decided they wanted to let me go. And I said, fine, it's time to move on. And I had an experience with my boss where he tried to intimidate me. And I said, yeah, this is not going to work. And more, using different words. And he erupted in a narcissistic rage.
Hmm.
I mean, it was terrifying. The blood drained out of his face, his pupils dilated. And to this day, you know, it was so terrifying that if he had a weapon, I could be dead. That was my reaction. I ended up just turning around and walking out of his office. And I had to work for him for another year. And I never spoke to him again, even though he was my boss.
Mm-hmm.
I would scan the campus to see if he was out walking around to avoid him because I just didn't want to deal with it. Well, about almost a year later, I had another experience where for some reason I got an email from his office inadvertently, and it threw me into a panic attack just seeing his name in my inbox. And at that time, my wife got a phone call from her brother, and I knew something was wrong. And I went out to talk to her, and she said that was my brother. His stepson, 19-year-old stepson, committed suicide the night before. And I couldn't put it together which nephew it was. There was an at-risk nephew who I was convinced that was the one who died, but it was not. It was the goody two-shoes kid who died. And I realized that I had a problem. Well, I subsequently discovered that I had full-blown PTSD from that experience, from that traumatic experience. And I had started work on an orchestral piece as just kind of a novel thing to do, only because I'd never written anything for the concert hall before. I was struggling to find a theme to base this piece of music on, and there was a shooting at a place called the Borderline Bar in Westlake, California, where 13 people died and 16 people were injured. And I immediately realized that I could use my musical storytelling skills to express what PTSD sufferers are loath to talk about because it re-triggers the event for them. So there's this big gap in understanding between what goes on inside the mind of somebody who suffers from PTSD, which is any trauma. It's not just guns and bombs. It could be car crashes.
Yeah,
it could
exactly.
be anything. It could be anything.
Yes.
So there's this gap between lay people, the rest of the world, and in terms of understanding, awareness, and the people who suffer. You know, at the time, at any given moment, 10 million people in America were suffering from PTSD. It's a huge, enormous problem. In the ensuing years, it's grown. It's grown. I mean, you know, for crying out loud, I mean, gun violence is the #1 killer of kids. There's been more school shootings in America than days of this year. So it's kind of become my mission to take my understanding and my personal experience and push it out there using all of what I've learned through the years in business, in music, in life, as a teacher, in a way that creates a self-care methodology for people to alleviate anxiety and depression, combined with an orchestral concert, which is designed to be a community engagement event, to bring people together, to sit them down in the theater and then portray a story of two families struggling to cope with a school shooting followed by the pandemic, as a way of saying, somebody, instead of like saying, oh my God, I'm going to go postal and go crazy, to create some level of intimacy and empathy for people in the community. Because now in today's world, it's like so pervasive. It's just nuts to me that 66 million people in America are suffering from diagnosable mental illness symptoms.
Yep.
That's like 25% of Americans, and they have no access to treatment. Here in Nashville, I did a study of the school district, and there's one, in that study, I discovered that there's one licensed therapist per 735 people. So now you have a situation where you have teenagers who are depressed, trying to cope with something that's never happened before in human history, and their parents who are lost as well, with no access to treatment. It can take months to get an appointment with a therapist. Well, chances are somebody's suicidal. They'll kill themselves before they get to that appointment. Hundreds and hundreds of teenagers spend the night in the ER because they have no place else to turn.
You know what?
Sorry to get into a rant here, but this is like really, really important.
No, because it actually, one thing, I worked in a federal prison for 25 years, right? And you can only imagine being in that environment.
Sure.
And I was always wondering, and I think, at one point where I was at, we had like 5,000 inmates. We had probably 3 psychologists, and hypothetically maybe 5 social workers. And I'm like, what are we? How is this going to work? And then I was just recently looking at the numbers in regards to minorities being, the therapists. It like out of the, got into the numbers as far as males and females, and we was talking about the different races. Like 4% of the therapists are Black.
Oh, it's just nothing. And then what is it? 40% or higher of Black women in America have been sexually abused.
Yeah, and even 1% of those are the therapists. Only 1% are males. I was talking to a friend of mine out in Detroit today, and I was thinking, through social media and through contacts and networks, I was like, I think I know all the 1%, but I'm just thinking about, even as you go forward and what you're actually doing, and how we're using, the therapy's not available, so now we have something that we can offer in regards to how we cope with PTSD, how do we cope with anger and depression, and what are the things that you're actually doing?
What am I doing? Well, this has been quite a journey for me, developing this project. It originally started as a piece of music that has evolved into a 60-minute concert with an original film with actors. And I've written the score, I've written the script, I've cut a demo movie. And all along, I thought, well, if I could leverage a symphony's existing community engagement education network, I could take this message into schools. Well, Symphony World is kind of stuck in the status quo, and it's really difficult to get their attention. So as I got to the end of the concert phase, I realized I needed to build an online course, which I have a lot of experience in, that can be put into schools to take this idea of using music to manipulate your physiological and neurological responses. And I ended up doing an enormous amount of research to understand how music affects the brain, how the brain works, and what are the components of the fight-flight response. So now, in lieu of, I didn't have the money to go out and hire a researcher to do a study for me, so I had to do it all myself, right? So after reading numerous academic papers about brain function, now I totally understand how the different parts of the brain interact to assess whether or not you're under threat or in a state of equilibrium, is what it's called. And the thing about it, most people don't understand that trauma is an injury. It is not a disorder. Huge distinction. A disorder is something where you treat the symptoms. An injury is something that you can heal. Big, big difference. So armed with that knowledge, I started to put together all of this research, and I came up with this concept, which I'm currently testing, that uses music. Our brains, from the moment we're born until the moment we die, our brain remembers everything that we experience. There are no gaps. We may block them out so we don't want to access them, but our brain remembers them, right? So my concept behind this is to teach people a method by which they can provide what I call alternative sensory data to their brains when they start feeling like, oh my God, the world's coming apart, and I'm freaking out and I don't know what to do, instead of like burying into addiction or scrolling on endlessly on social media. You can, if you have a skill that you can have practiced, that that works, when you start to feel uncomfortable like that, you generate a sense of awareness of your physical being. If you have a skill that you can latch onto, you can go to that skill to be able to alleviate your discomfort. So the way that it works specifically, it's a combination of pre-shot routine, which is what every athlete does. Every high-performing athlete has a pre-shot routine. You talk to Michael Jordan about shooting free throws, and he will tell you that he does exactly the same thing every time. Tiger Woods has not changed his pre-shot routine since he was a child. Okay, this is what a pre-shot routine does. Is the science behind it is it stops the self-talk. It quiets the brain to where you can focus on the present moment. That's number one. That's what a pre-shot routine does.
Yeah,
it can be anything. It doesn't matter. The point is repetition. So you train your brain that when you do this activity, jumping around in a circle for 2 minutes, whatever it is, it doesn't make a hell of a difference. Whatever works for you, that then you are training your brain to, whenever you jump around in the circle that same way, that your brain knows, oh, it's time to calm down, right? Yeah. Combine that with a yoga breathing technique where you're breathing in sync with a piece of music, where you're trying to actively control your respiration to improve the blood flow to your brain and lower your blood pressure. All right. And then the third part of this is, just as a background, when I got into this, mindfulness is a big deal. A lot of people talk about mindfulness. Sure. But in living in the South, I hear, Carrie Underwood and Tim McGraw all day, that's the music of this part of the country. And so at least parts of the country, not all, but parts. But I realized that mindfulness, if it's based on Tibetan bowls, for example, Asian instruments, is music from a different culture. And it won't resonate the same as music from the culture that the person resides in. And so if you're trying to get somebody to practice mindfulness, in essence, what you have to ask them to jump that cultural divide and surrender to a different culture. So with this notion of tempo, your body reacting to tempo involuntarily, if you can find a piece of music that triggers or activates a positive memory, a loving memory, a safe memory, right? At a specific tempo, range and tempo, slow song, fast song, your brain is going to react in all sorts of ways to the music that you're listening to. And if you combine all three of those elements together, what you're doing is bombarding your brain to say, oh, time out. We gotta stop and think differently here for a second.
Yeah.
You know? Because the thing about trauma is, because it's an injury, and PTSD is basically a memory from the past. An injury from the past is your brain misperceives that memory as being in the present moment, right? So your hippocampus is telling the amygdala that, oh, this is happening right now. You're under threat, and then that triggers all this fight, flight, and all this anxiety and all this insanity, based on a misperception in the brain of the data that it's receiving through your senses.
And would there be different genres of music, or
it could be any genre of music? It doesn't matter. As long as it falls within that tempo range and it triggers a memory of what you're trying to achieve. Everybody's going to be different. I mean, I'm not a hip hop guy, just naturally, but I can't imagine that even hip hop, if it's connected to a memory that is positive in your experience at that specific tempo range, that you wouldn't have similar results.
Yeah.
And the whole point of this is to make sure that the choice of music is not prescriptive. It's personalized to the user's experience. So then it becomes relevant to the individual, as opposed to somebody trying to learn and adopt something and assimilate something that has little meaning to them.
And where do you, if you could fast forward this, let's say 5 years, where would you like to be with this?
My dream has always been to have it be adopted as a part of school curriculum. Take 3 minutes before every class, which is not a long time, and do a group activity, much like singing in church, where the class knows that, oh, we're going to listen to this song now, we're going to do this exercise, and we're going to breathe this way, to improve student performance. And it's basically free, right? And it's basically accessible by any age, any race, any socio-economical point of view. Doesn't matter. It's just leave it to the individual, the teacher, the student, to decide what's relevant for them, and then take it and run. Because at that point it becomes a pebble in a pond.
Yeah.
Right. And it'll just spread, because if you get it into the schools, then it's going to get into the home. And if it gets into the home, it will change the dynamic of the communication between parents and kids.
Well, the community as well.
Well, and then at the tail end of this is some sort of community-based event that revolves around this concept, to say it doesn't matter what neighborhood you're from, doesn't matter what you look like, doesn't matter how old you are, we're all the same, and we have stuff to learn and to gain, more to gain by being connected with one another than being driven by the fear of loss of what we have.
I love it, Chris. I love
So
it.
it's a grand vision, my friend. I mean, it's a big, big thought, but
Well, I mean, I really appreciate you just coming on here, as far as the Let's Go show, and talking about, of course, your past, and some of the things you're doing and the vision ahead, because these are the thoughts, these are the innovative things that we want to be into our schools, to be into our communities, to have an impact, even within our families, for us to move forward with everything we're
well,
doing.
hopefully so, man. It's like I'm, I see my role for the majority of my life. I've been a doer.
Mm-hmm.
I've been actively doing stuff.
Yeah.
And my role, as I've gotten into this project more and more, I realize that my role has changed.
Hmm.
My role, I've become the spark plug for an idea.
I love it.
And I have no, it's like there's no way to quantify it, the
Mm-hmm.
result. There's no way to really
But you have to do something. I think
Yeah,
that's
well,
what
I
we.
have to do something.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's
yeah.
what we are. Like, we have to do something based
You
on
bet.
what we know, based on the things that we see. Like, we have to do something. We can't just be idle and
Well,
play.
the downside of it is either we cease to exist, which is
Mm-hmm.
a possibility, or humanity changes to a point where it's unrecognizable to what has come before. We are the Borg, you will be assimilated. I
Yeah.
mean, that's entirely possible. So it's, part of it's my age,
Mhm.
but it's there is definitely a fuse lit. And we don't have a lot of time to wait around for somebody else to pull the trigger. And it's like the crazy thing about this is I'm so committed to this that because this is my authentic self. I haven't had to wear somebody else's clothes to do this. I didn't have to change myself to do this.
Wow.
Right? You take a job, you have a career, there's constant compromises along the way. And I'm fortunate enough to be able to have the time and the resources, even though I'm doing this for $0, bootstrapping, to be able to say, I have nobody to answer to but me. And I'm, like I said earlier, I've lived a life that few people can imagine. And it just can't stop with me. I'm not that selfish. And so if I'm going to leave a legacy, doing this movie, doing that movie, who cares? It's a story, it's a movie, but if I can be impactful, I have two granddaughters, 3 and 5 years old. If I can have an impact in their lives to where the world is different, that they inherit, rather than feeling powerless in the face of all of this, then I'll go to my grave with a big smile on my face, and yeah, how much better can it be than that? And the wild thing about this is that I truly believe that everyone is capable of this. People may view me as being special and unique or what have you. The only uniqueness about me is that I just lay it out there and tell the truth as I see it, and if you agree, great. If you don't, well, then that's fine too. But I don't live in a state of fear. and the more that we can bring people together, that fear will subside, and the world will. It's like I always look at the glass half full. It's like AI has the potential to change humanity in an amazingly positive way.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to be committed to making that change in that direction, rather than letting fear and ignorance dictate our actions.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's my soapbox.
Well, hey, Chris, I really appreciate you actually coming on to the Let's Go show and expressing everything. I'm looking forward to it. There's
Great,
been
man.
so much you've actually shared and all your accomplishment, and yet you still want to get back to us as a people, us as a culture of us moving forward. So thank you for coming in.
Oh,
One
it's
thing
my pleasure. Thanks for being a patient listener.
well, this is what I do.
So in closing, I'll send you a link to
Okay.
my project is called The Missing Link, and the URL is themissinglink.mykajabi.com. I'll send you a link because we're in a private beta at the moment, meaning that the course is open for free to anybody who wants to try it. And the only request is that you complete the assessments, so I can get some data to say, is it working, is it not working?
Yeah.
But I encourage all your listeners, if you have an interest in checking it out, I'm easily found on social media. So if you don't remember or you don't have it, just look for me on Facebook or LinkedIn, and I'll be happy to push you in that direction.
Well, we'll definitely include that on all our social media streams as far as the link and your contact information. Once again, thank you for coming. And
My pleasure, man. Be well, and thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
And as we see on the Let's Go show, peace. We out. All right. Thank you, Chris.
See ya.